Yeah, my name is Kendra Mohn, and I serve Trinity Lutheran Church in Fort Worth. I'm lead pastor there. I used to be teaching pastor there, and now I'm lead pastor there in a partnership with Matt Schroeder. I was ordained in 2005, so we're coming up on 14 years, which is hard to believe. I finished my PhD just over a year ago at Bright Divinity School in New Testament, and my dissertation work, I talk about masculinity, Roman masculinity in the Roman Empire, and then how that intersects with the New Testament. And specifically, I was looking at the Gospel of Matthew and male figures in the Gospel of Matthew. So
wonderful. I'd love to hear your call story. How did you experience your call to ministry, and maybe then what motivated you to do further study?
Yeah, I think it evolved over many years. And when I was a kid, people mentioned something about maybe someday you would serve the church. I found other things to do for a really long time. I studied music and music history and communication, did some other things, did a graduate program in music history. And then eventually I decided that I wanted to serve the church as a scholar. And so I went, but I knew I wanted to be ordained because I felt like that was really part of the integrity of the call. So I went to Luther Seminary and got an MDiv. And while I was there, I could feel this kind of internal positive tension between both being a scholar and being a pastor. And hearing about the history of the Reformation, that's very much a part of those early reformers, scholar pastors and pastor scholars. So my call has always been sort of a tension between those two things. Where exactly do I fit in the moment, and what does that mean? Do I fit more in the parish and then lean more towards the academy, or the opposite? But I usually find myself kind of on the bridge between the two. I'm going back and forth. So I was ordained in my home church at Bethlehem Lutheran in Cherokee, Iowa. Served my first call in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, where I was associate pastor. Then my senior retired, and they didn't have an interim available for the congregation, so I became the interim senior. And that's the year that I applied to graduate school. And so after that, we moved to Texas so that I could start the PhD program. And I thought for a while that would mean that I would really back away from the parish. And I was part-time, really part-time when we first got to Trinity. But it seems like things continue to develop in surprising ways. So even though I've finished the degree, I am now more in the parish than I've ever been. And so I think my call story continues to evolve in ways that I could not have anticipated. And so open to what the future will look like and how all these pieces will come together. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I wonder, we talk with pastors who are second career. Did you consider music kind of your first career before you went into ministry?
I think so. I just did one graduate degree. Those are just 2 years in between college and seminary. So I definitely explored all of those career fields, but I don't think I got down the track very far. I'm really thankful for that experience of having moved so far away from home to do that graduate degree. I lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I didn't know anybody within 4 or 5 states. And that's when the church really became important to me personally as a community, that I could attend campus ministry and I could have immediate community and people who could speak a similar language to me. Because the program that I was in was global and everybody was from a different background, and that had its own richness, but being able to come to the church really made a difference in that time in my life. So I don't know if it's second career exactly, maybe a career and a half. But I really value that time in between before I committed to being in the candidacy process, because it really did form me in different ways. Yeah.
And there's obviously natural connections between one's study of music and one's preparation for ministry, since music is so much a part of our life in the church.
Especially when you study Western art music, so much of that is history of the church, so there's a lot of overlap. And most of my college classmates would find it very funny that I spend most of my musical energy now singing rather than playing cello. That wasn't what I did in college, and certainly wasn't. There were real singers in my college. But the music has really dovetailed nicely into working together with my musicians at the congregation and just looking at the heritage of our church. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what would you say is one of your greatest joys in parish ministry now that since your locus of ministry now is the parish?
Yeah. I've always been somebody who really appreciates hearing other people's stories of vocation And I think that comes in two ways. One is that the parish I'm part of now really is a place that produces people for ministry. And so walking alongside and mentoring people as they go through the candidacy process, as they move through seminary, that's been a huge joy. But it's much bigger than that. It's about baptismal vocation, right? So everybody, as they sort of explore what it is God has called them to do in their lives, when they come to me and I'm able to have those really personal conversations with them about what their giftedness is. I mean, people light up when you can reflect back to them, here's what I see your giftedness being in the world. And having those sort of personal, intimate conversations about what people are gifted to do, and then seeing them be able to do it, whether that's in the parish or it's in their job or it's with their parenting or however they do that, I think that's one of my greatest joys. Yeah.
Obviously, God is working through everybody in the world, and we're celebrating the ordination of women. So I'd love to ask you, how do you see God working through the women that you have in your parish and in your life and that you know in the world?
That's a huge question.
Yeah, sorry.
I think we live in a really dynamic time when there's so much versatility in how people can express their calls. It's great to be a part of a congregation where women are at all levels of leadership and service within the congregation. So that's really important to see. A lot of it is, I think, the church provides community, especially for younger women. And in the old days, you didn't have anybody. I didn't even meet a woman in ministry until I was well into high school, and a woman bishop until I was in college. So the fact that the church can show young women, girls and young women, all of these ways to be faithful in the world and all of these ways to serve God, I think I see that primarily as a mom. My kids may never be ordained, and that's fine, but they're able to see all of these other women and all of the ways that they have found to live out their vocation. And I think that's really powerful and a gift we can offer to younger women for sure. I was asked to write some of the Bible studies for the 50th anniversary of the ordination of women for the ELCA. And in going back and doing that work, and I worked with a friend of mine who I knew from seminary who does Old Testament. And as we wrote the Bible studies and we looked back at all the depictions of women, there's not nearly as many stories as we would like. But the stories that we have are so rich, and I think they open up possibilities. And so being able to see yourself in those, going all the way back and drawing on our heritage and then opening things up for the future, I think that's a really nice sweet spot that we have as a church.
Beautiful. The church is going through a course of whole life of transition in the current century. And I wonder, how do you see, or what is your vision for how women will play a role in the future of the church?
I think it's an interesting time because we've seen a big change in the Conference of Bishops and a lot of more women voices. I think it's very interesting that the roles of lead pastors still continue to be dominated by men, and that's a different process and a different trajectory that's happening. I would love to see in the future, women represented sort of at all levels of the churches of leadership and the service. And I think what that will do is I think it will broaden our understanding of what a leader is. That's what my husband works in leadership studies. And so we have a lot of conversations about this, and opening up different ways of being a leader in the world is good for everybody. It's like I study masculinity, because there's oftentimes this one sense of an ideal, but when we break it open, then there's so much more room for so many other people to express God's gifts in the world. So that's what I'm looking forward to. Mm-hmm.
I'm really interested in hearing, since you spend so much time studying masculinity, are there female images of God that speak to you, that are a part of your theology, that feed you spiritually?
Absolutely. And the reason that I didn't come into masculinity wanting to study masculinity, I came in wanting to study gender because I saw it so much a part of our embodiment in the world, but then also these sort of social expectations that we're expected to fit into. So I think it all fits together. And whenever we have kind of one image that dominates too much, then it can become oppressive for all who are involved. So when I think of feminine images for God or for the divine, there's two. The first is the idea of holy wisdom, which is not part of my specific academic work, but is so well fleshed out in our tradition. And the ability to think of the divine feminine in each of us as the way we express wisdom or the way that God imparts wisdom to us is a really powerful thing, I think. And the second one is just always the image of the mother hen and the way that she would give her life, and that Jesus chooses to express his own sacrifice for us in that way, that it is a life-giving sacrifice, and it's one that gives the future generations hope. That to me is a really powerful thing. Too often, I think with women, we can go to a sacrificial image too quickly, and that in our culture, that's seen as culturally sanctioned, that women are expected to sort of give away their lives for other people. And so I'm always very careful about using that imagery. But the fact that Jesus does it in this way, redeems it a little bit for me and gives it this kind of life-giving power. Julie of Norwich, we're doing a thing about her at my church this fall, and I spent a lot of time reading about her. And she really does that thing of connecting Jesus to the image of mother, and that's the life-giving kind of image. And yet Jesus is resurrected. So it isn't that you give yourself away for nothing. It's that you are a part of what the divine is doing in the world.
We're going to shift a little bit to more spiritual questions,
okay,
if that's okay.
Uh-huh.
And I'm wondering if you could share one of your most, doesn't have to be your most significant, but a significant experience where God became real for you, either in prayer or ministry, where you just had a tangible experience of God's real presence with you.
That's hard to choose one.
It is hard to choose one. I have a hard time too.
I'm going to go with the most recent one because it's the most, it's the one that's staying with me, I think, the most. And that was at Churchwide Assembly this year. I got to be a part of the procession of women to celebrate the 50th anniversary. And Eric said, you should bring your alb, they're going to do this thing. And so I brought my alb and my green stole. And I was a little early because I wasn't a voting member. So I got to go back to where they were all robing. And so I got my robe on and I was ready. And it was not an enormous room. It was a large room. And the women just kept coming and kept coming and kept coming and kept coming into the room. And finally, I thought, I got to get out of here. I'm never going to get out of here. So I went and stood in the hallway and kind of climbed up a few steps and just watching all of the women arrive of all the different ages and all the different experiences in ministry and the beauty of all of the different stoles. And anybody who's ever had a stole knows there's usually a story about that stole. And so I was thinking about all the stories of that stole. And that's when you get, as we used to talk about in college, the little hairs on the back of your neck, when you sing a really beautiful piece. And that's what I experienced in that moment. So often ministry can be isolating, doesn't matter your gender. Ministry can be isolating. Particularly sometimes for women in leadership, it can feel that way. And to have all of these people in this one place really was very cool. And then as we walked in, it was like this spontaneous party had erupted in the hall, and all of these people, all of the men were standing there cheering and clapping and singing. And there was an amazing gospel choir up front. And so it was hard you'd have to try really hard not to feel God in that moment and the Spirit with you, because you were surrounded by it. You were surrounded by all this history, but then also this hope. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You have a full life as a mom and a pastor and a scholar and the spouse of not only a pastor, but a bishop. I am the spouse of a pastor of another denomination and 3 kids, but they're all grown now. But I know the complicated juggle that life can be. And so I'm wondering what sustains you spiritually in the midst of all that.
Yeah. I didn't do a very good job of it during the program. I will say that. There were definite times where it doesn't work. And I want to say that because I think sometimes then feeling balanced or having a rich spiritual life can sometimes feel like one more thing. And then in our tradition, we talk about that as the law. The law doesn't bring life, right? So there are definite times in my life where that has not been the case. And I often find time on any given day, I can really only do one thing really well, where I feel like I've done what God has asked me to do in that day. But I will say, after the program was over, my congregation is really great about being a lab for study and for exploration. So we did this series on Sabbath, and we learned together about the biblical traditions, the theological traditions of Sabbath, why we do Sabbath, and then what Sabbath practices are. And that was really important for me because it was Luther's whole thing about one day a week, you should try with all your might to do nothing, because that's a reminder of what God is doing and when God acts. And so since that time, I have really found power and rejuvenation in that idea that this is part of my theology, to sit and do nothing with all of my might so that I might remember what God is doing. So that has been really important for me in the last year as we've sort of recovered from these programs and moved into a different phase of life with bigger kids. I've really come to appreciate that time.